the chat that we have a very global audience for this webinar this afternoon, this morning, this evening, wherever you're dialing in from. I'm just going to wait 1 or 2 moments. We have started the recording, but I'll just wait until we've reached the top of the hour, maybe just shortly afterwards. I see we still have people joining as I speak. So my name is Andrea Powell. I am the publisher coordinator for Research for Life, and I work on behalf of the STM Association, which is one of the core partners of Research for Life. And I'm very happy to be moderating this webinar this afternoon. So I think since we have a lot to get through this afternoon, I'm going to keep saying this afternoon because I'm in the UK and it's my afternoon here. So apologies for that. But today we have quite a lot of material to get through, so I think we will make a start. So welcome. This is the second in a new series of webinars focusing on publishing and research communication. And for those of you who attended the first webinar last week, you will know that this series is structured around the research life cycle and is designed to provide an introduction to some of the issues that face researchers as producers and authors of knowledge, rather than simply as readers and consumers of other scientists' output. And this graphic on the screen shows a very simplified research life cycle, which we've been following while planning this series. So the 6 series cover idea development, the conduct of research and publishing ethics, the broader research landscape, and disseminating research. And for the first time within the Research for Life partnership, this series has been developed by a collaborative task force involving publishers and other Research for Life partners. And the recording will be available from the Research for Life website approximately 5 days after today's session. As this program is being run as a pilot, after each webinar, attendees will be sent an online survey so that we can receive as much feedback as possible and also gauge the interest in future topics. So please complete your survey when it arrives. Today's topic is open science from open access to open research. And as you will find out, this is a very, very broad subject. Today's presenters, I am delighted to say, are Dr. Anna Persic, who is the Acting Chief of Section for Science Policy and Partnerships at the Division of Science Policy and Capacity Building at the UNESCO headquarters in Paris. Roheena Anand, who is the Executive Director for Global Publishing Development at PLOS. Andy Robinson, who is the Managing Director for Publishing and Knowledge Business at CABI. And myself, I'm just going to be kicking us off and wrapping us up at the end. So the scope of open science is incredibly broad, and we cannot possibly cover it in great detail in just 1 hour. So this webinar is designed to provide a high-level overview of what we mean by open science, what its relevance is to the delivery of the SDGs, and how it relates in particular to the Research for Life community. So our agenda for today is as follows. We'll kick off with a presentation from Anna on the UNESCO recommendation on open science, and she'll also cover why open science is so important for the delivery of the objectives set out in the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. We're then going to move on to Roheena, who's going to cover open science and then start to drill down into how it affects the publishing process and the Research for Life community in particular. Andy's going to focus in on open data and how it has a practical application in the field of agriculture. We'll cover some key challenges and considerations along the way, and then, time permitting, we'll go into some questions. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to hand over to Anna, who's going to tell us about the UNESCO recommendation on open science. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and thank you again for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here with you today. And I'm also impressed by, the number of participants and also the diversity of participants that we have today. And hopefully we will have some time also for discussion and for questions and answers. So I'm going to start sharing my, my screen. I just want to start from the beginning. And as Andrea said, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the UNESCO recommendation on open science, but also I will be talking about that in a broader context of why science is important and then why open science is important. And when I was asked to do this presentations, I was looking a little bit among the different, science-related quotes that we have or that I've heard. And I found that these three might be quite relevant to what we are talking about today. One is about science as an engine of prosperity. And then if you look around at the wealth of civilization today, it's the wealth that comes from science. And here the wealth is intended not just material wealth, but also all the benefits that we can receive from science, including for health and for life. The other important kind of dimension of science, which is particularly relevant when we talk about open science, is that there is need for more science, for better science, and for science that is not just about technology or leisure or even health or longevity, but also the hope of wisdom of which kind of culture we must acquire for its survival. So it's really the idea of having science that embodies knowledge that helps us survive and thrive in today's world. And another quote for an ambassador from UNESCO, an ambassador to Portugal. He was a former ambassador of Portugal to UNESCO who actually brought open science to UNESCO. He said that while education remains the most important means of fighting inequalities at the individual level, in the 21st century, science is the best way to fight inequalities between countries and regions. And we do know that inequalities within countries, within regions, are becoming one of the key challenges of today's world. And again, science through the open science lens can be very helpful in this regard. Going more to the Sustainable Development Goals, and I understand that this community, the participants know about the United Nations Sustainable Development Agenda and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Well, I would argue, and I'm sure that many of us would agree, that actually science really cuts across all the different SDGs, all the 17 SDGs. And it is really critical, both science, technology, innovation, for achieving economic, social, and environmental sustainability. So the different goals that deal with these different issues, many of them, if not all of them, actually have components that really depend on how we produce knowledge, how we use it, how we use science, technology, and innovation to achieve these sustainable development goals. And actually at the United Nations level, we see open science more and more as a possible accelerator for the achievement of sustainable development goals. But to go there and to achieve the SDGs, knowing that that we don't have that much time left also, and that probably there will be something that will remain for the future. But what we've learned so far in trying to achieve the SDGs is that we really have to rely on sustainable, innovative solutions. And those solutions require an efficient and transparent and very vibrant scientific community, which is not only coming from scientists themselves, but from a society as a whole. We've seen the need to kind of democratize science a little bit more, and including the entire scientific process, make it more efficient, more equitable, more transparent and inclusive. Because actually the solutions and kind of the building of science, we realize can be done in so many different ways, and kind of limiting ourselves only to the scientific closed communities is not necessarily the way forward. So again, there is a need for open science. And then, of course, we have all been through and still are going through the COVID era. And if there are some lessons that we've learned there, it really is about the importance of timely and free access to scientific data, publication, and information, the importance of scientific collaborations and sharing of information at all levels, and the importance of science policy society dialogue, because the solutions that have to be found really have to also go through this science policy society dialogue. And again, here we see the importance and the need for open science. And we also saw through COVID that it is possible to change the way we do science, both in terms of reaching out to the public more and reaching out to others beyond the scientific community, but also in terms of making the research data and the research publications more available. And we've seen so far, we have some of the statistics that in general, we have around 70% of all scientific publications that are still locked beyond paywalls. But in the case of COVID, we were able to reverse this trend and have almost around 85% of COVID-19 related publications, which are actually open access. So that changes the way we receive information and use information. And there is no reason why this should only be limited to COVID-19 related publications. Other areas would very much benefit from the same, if not bigger, amount of openness in those areas, be it climate change or biodiversity loss or other environmental, social, or economic issues. So for us in the United Nations, in UNESCO, which is the UN Organization for Education, Science, Culture, and Communication, open science really has the potential to increase the quality of science, because it makes the entire scientific process and its outputs more accessible, more transparent, more collaborative, and more inclusive. As I said, it can be a game changer in bridging the science, technology, and innovation gaps between and within countries, and fulfilling the human right to science. And then, as I said, the open science is increasingly also seen as a critical accelerator for the achievement of sustainable development goals. But in order for open science to fulfill this potential, it really is important that it's done right and that it is done in a transparent and in an equitable way. And we've seen that there were many different movements around open science coming up in the past few decades. But until now, we did not have an international policy and action framework around open science. We did not have a common definition of what open science is or a shared set of values and principles. And that is why in UNESCO, the 193 member states of UNESCO tasked the organization in 2019 to actually develop standard setting instrument, an international standard setting instrument on open science, which is a UNESCO recommendation on open science, and to submit it to member states for adoption 2 years later. So for 2 years, since 2019 until 2021, November 2021, we have conducted quite a broad consultative process to understand what are the elements of open science, what are the definitions of open science, what are the challenges of open science and actions that countries at international level and different actors that are involved in open science need to take to make open science a reality that is really just and benefits everybody. So after this process, and I do want to thank different entities that are present here that did provide a lot of input into this text of the recommendation. We had a series of regional meetings, consultations, thematic consultations. We've asked different actors, including the publishers, scientists, young scientists, funders to provide inputs. Again, trying to understand also in different regions, what are the differences in seeing open science and understanding what open science is. So in the end, we did manage to come up with a text that not only was acceptable, I would say, for the different experts that provided different inputs, but it was also very much acceptable for the 193 member states of UNESCO that anonymously adopted this text in November last year. So now the countries who have adopted the recommendation do have a legal framework within which to operate open science and have to report back to UNESCO every 4 years on the progress made. So just at a glance, some highlights. The recommendation, as I said, is the first international normative instrument on open science with an agreed definition, consensus core values and guiding principles for open science actions. It also addresses multiple actors and stakeholders of open science. And I think it was important to understand the broadness of open science and the different actors that have to come together for open science to work. It recommends actions on different levels, proposes some innovative approaches for open science in different stages of the scientific process, and also calls for development of a comprehensive open science monitoring framework that would not only look into the numbers of open science, but also into the impacts of open science. So just very briefly, in terms of what the definition is, the definition really is, as I said, quite broad. It gathers all the different movements that make science. Open science is an ensemble of different movements and practices to make scientific knowledge available, accessible, reusable, that increase scientific collaboration, sharing of information for benefits of all, and opens the processes of scientific creation, scientific knowledge creation, evaluation, and communication to societal actors beyond the traditional scientific community. So it's really opening up science to scientists and beyond the scientific community to society. There are several pillars of open science, open scientific knowledge, which includes open access, open research data, open educational resources, hardware and source. Open science infrastructures is another key pillar with virtual and physical open science infrastructures. Open engagement of societal actors through citizen science, participatory science, crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, different ways in which we can actually engage society in the actual scientific process. And then open dialogue with other knowledge systems, including indigenous knowledge and marginalized scholars. So a broad vision of what open means, as we said, going from open access all the way to open into society. The member states also agreed to prioritize their action in some priority action areas. And those really go around the kind of awareness raising of what open science is and what are the benefits and challenges, but also an understanding of the fact that open science cannot be applied in exactly the same way for different disciplines and across different sectors or for different actors. So this diversity of implementation of open science or operationalization of open science is something that is very much present in the recommendation. Developing an enabling policy environment, investment in infrastructures, investment, of course, in capacity building, both institutional and human, fostering a culture of open science, aligning incentives, and promoting international and multi-stakeholder collaboration in the area of open science. And everything in view really to reduce digital, technological, and knowledge gaps. Now just a little mention of the key challenges that we have identified along the way, and particularly now that we are starting the implementation and support to member states to implement the recommendation. We see maybe 5 areas, broad areas, as the most challenging, or where most of the challenges are. It's a change in the conventional scientific culture. There is need for the entire scientific system and the culture itself to change, to adapt to open science and the principles of open science. The human and institutional capacity definitely needs to be built. There is need to invest in adequate infrastructures, including in reliable internet connectivity, which still remains a problem for a great number of countries and institutions that use open science. Alignment of incentives, revision of criteria for evaluation of scientific excellence and scientific careers, and then addressing some of these unintended negative consequences of open science practices, including the article processing charges or other possible consequences of open science, which were not intended, of course, in the conception of open science. And we see some 5 areas in which we can, while working in those areas, impact and address these challenges: capacity building, policies, financing and incentives, infrastructures, and monitoring. And this is where, from the UNESCO side, at the international level, we are again trying to galvanize the broader open science community to help us create either guidance or guidelines or toolkits that would be needed in these areas to help countries and different actors to actually very concretely and practically operationalize those the recommendations. We will be working in these different working groups, and we do really on capacity building policies, funding, and infrastructures and monitoring. These working groups are very open we really are looking forward to having different actors on board, from scientists to publishers to funders, investors, innovators, citizen science, etc. So to provide some input into this guidance for implementation and operationalization of open science. We're also gathering some good practices because we do understand that it's an area that is starting. I mean, there are some good practices already, but there is more to be learned, and there is a lot to be learned from each other as well. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to invite everybody, of course, to be part of the movement, and happy to provide more information as we move forward. Thank you for that, Andrea.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Anna. And I would like to repeat, it's been mentioned a couple of times, but the presentation slides, the recording will all be available afterwards. So don't worry about scribbling down lots of links and email addresses. But maybe later on, if we have time, Anna, we could you could tell us what the best way for people to go about participating in those working groups might be.
With pleasure. Yes, thank you.
Okay, fabulous. I am going to throw my screen up again now and hand over to Roheena, who's going to take us through the next section of this webinar today.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks, Anna, for giving us that introduction to the UNESCO Open Science recommendation. And I think that's a nice point for me to start off, actually, the definition of open science from that recommendation, because there are several concepts within that I think are really relevant for how research should be communicated and how, therefore, we should set up processes to enable and facilitate that. So those concepts are, the first one and really important one is inclusiveness, and the fact that it's not only part of open science, but core to its principles. Open science is not one thing, but a combination of various movements and practices, all of which combine and contribute to making knowledge more available, more accessible, and more reproducible, ultimately so that knowledge can have the tangible desired benefit, not just for further knowledge creation, but also for society and humanity. When done right, open science enables and facilitates global collaboration and participation, and it focuses, as Anna was saying, on the processes of scientific knowledge creation, its evaluation, and also its communication. And lastly, it applies to all disciplines, not just scientific, technical, engineering, and medical ones. And so, in a way, we're talking about science as an organized system of criticism rather than a specific discipline or disciplines, and encompassing very much the social sciences and humanities as well. So let's go a bit further into and drill down a bit more into what we mean by open science. And these helpful definitions on screen come from a report from the National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine that was titled Open Science by Design, really looking at how you could design from scratch a world that works with, or a research ecosystem that works with open at its core. And so a bit more of a scientific lens on this. But again, several really important factors here. The first one being that open science, rather than being a separate or standalone part of the scientific or research enterprise, it's intrinsic to the whole research life cycle and the whole process of doing research. That is, from ideation and planning and designing research to conducting research and generating knowledge, through to validating, analysing and interpreting that knowledge, and then of course to dissemination and reporting and sharing it. And we can view open science through both philosophical and practical lenses. Philosophically, we recognise that research is a fundamentally collaborative endeavour, and that open inquiry is at the heart of the research enterprise. Practically, we ensure availability and usability of a multiplicity of research outputs, increasing transparency and making the outputs available to everyone to use and to build upon. So moving on, as I said, open science very much underpins the whole research enterprise and process. It involves greater transparency in the processes of scientific knowledge creation, evaluation and communication, and increased access to different research outputs. Philosophically, though, it's very much linked to the traditional values and norms of science and research, collaboration, discussion, inquiry. And practically, it can help to build credibility and trust in science through that increased transparency. All with the outcome that it enables researchers to address new questions and work across national and disciplinary boundaries. It should increase collaboration and equitable participation. What does that transition to open science mean for researchers in conducting and communicating their research? While many will be familiar with the concepts of open access, access to publications, and in particular to published articles, really is only one part of an open science world. So when we think about communicating research, open is about more than being able to read an article. It's about providing the right context to understand it, the resources to replicate it, the tools to collaborate and make science better. And open science allows and encourages us to rethink how we share and consume research and to make that move from the constraints of the physical format and take advantage of the opportunities provided by a digital world. This moves us from publishing as an event that happens when an article appears to become a process that better mirrors how research is carried out and then communicated by researchers. So that might mean a registered report, which is a publication outlining the research that is planned and that is going to be done, through to a preprint or perhaps versions of preprints to share an early version of the work, through to a peer-reviewed article alongside which are the peer review materials. But then underpinned by those other research outputs that help to increase accessibility and reproducibility and comprehension of that knowledge. So the data, the methods or protocols, the code or materials, as well as iterations, future iterations to correct errors or to improve or add to results as the work is built upon or improved further. And therefore, an article is not really an article anymore, but becomes a digital knowledge stack, all linked together. We can categorize both philosophical and practical aspects of open science in publishing as follows. Transparent processes, such as open identifiers, such as ORCID, and we, well, at our publishers at PLOS, we really encourage and in some cases require authors to use identifiers such as ORCID for their own benefit, in that they ensure that their work is properly attributed to them and that they receive credit for it. And through integrations with other databases and services such as Researcher ID or Scopus, LinkedIn or Crossref, your ORCID profile automatically centralizes all of your scholarly contributions. And there are also initiatives such as the credit taxonomy, which aim to ensure that each author's individual contribution to a piece of research is defined and recognized. Preprints, as I just referenced earlier, and this is where authors share an early version of their work and can get public comments on it. The benefit of preprints is that they enable rapid dissemination of results. They can ensure and establish precedents for an idea or a group's work, hopefully leading to increased attention and citations. And more now we see funders and other committees allowing preprints to be used as part of grant applications or hiring or tenure committees. And hopefully we will see that trend continue. Through to open peer review in a journal. And when we talk about open peer review, that shouldn't mean that the peer review processes associated with it are any less rigorous or robust, or that the usual ethical checks are not applied, only that the related materials, i.e. the peer review comments and the editor's comments, are accessible to everyone. So one other category associated with open science practice in publishing is the sharing of multiple research outputs that help to tell that whole research story. From open data, codes or methods, amongst other outputs. And some journals will help and facilitate authors to do this. Through to ways of countering publication bias, and that's where papers that report positive results are more likely to be published. And one of the ways of countering that, for instance, is via a publication such as a registered report, where, as I mentioned just on the previous slide, it's outlining the research that is planned and that's going to be done, but where there's a commitment to publish the outcomes as long as the research is carried out in a methodologically and ethically rigorous manner, so irrespective of the perceived significance of the findings. And this is one of the ways that journals can have more inclusive criteria and encourage equitable participation. So I'm going to use a case study of one of our own journals here to demonstrate that further, that idea of inclusive criteria to publishing. And PLOS Biology is one of the PLOS portfolio. PLOS is a fully open access publisher. And it's a selective journal, and that selectivity is valued by the community, but also in a way has contributed to that reproducibility crisis in biology and biomedicine. And that's because of a culture where research showing what are perceived to be exciting results is valued over studies perhaps confirming results. So our aim has been to redefine that selectivity and to offer more inclusive criteria for publication. And we do that by focusing on the importance of the research question and the rigor of the research that has been done, rather than how exciting the result is. Because if a research question is worthy of funding or resourcing, then the outcome should be worthy of sharing. And so we would ask, what is the contribution to the scientific process? Are we learning something that will significantly advance its field, independent of the outcome? Are the approaches used adequate to answer this question in the best possible way? And has the research been executed to a high standard? And by focusing on the relevance of the research question and how the research has been conducted, we want to very much free researchers from any stigma that might surround negative or null results, and encourage them to pursue important lines of inquiry, even where expectations and what the outcomes might be are less clear. And so this journal contains a number of different publications to do that, from pre-registered research to data, but also discovery reports which share the discovery phase of research, and linked update articles which share confirmatory or contradictory findings, either by that original group or another one. All of which hopefully allows researchers to publish without introducing pressure to have that complete story. Another example of inclusive criteria in publishing is the PLOS Inclusion in Global Research editorial policy. And we developed this to address the issue of parachute research, which can also be known as helicopter or neo-colonial science. And this happens when researchers travel to under-resourced communities, conduct their research and leave, often with little understanding or involvement of the communities they studied, and few direct benefits to the local participants. And so to counter this, we developed a questionnaire with members of our editorial community and working alongside them. And this outlines ethical, cultural, and scientific considerations specific to inclusivity in global research. And it asks, for example, the reasons why, if there are no local authors included on the authorship list. And then this information can be provided to editors and reviewers during the peer review process to help them assess whether the research meets the journal's standards for the ethics of experimentation and research integrity. But journals should also reflect the broad and diverse communities who are active in their field to ensure that the scientific conversation taking place in that journal is a truly global one. So at PLOS, therefore, we intentionally designed our new journals to reflect diversity and equity of representation at all levels, whether that be editors, editorial boards, reviewers, or authors. And we actively seek out research from underrepresented communities. And this, of course, is especially relevant for topics such as the ones shown, which are core to the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm going to finish with a few challenges and considerations around open access and open science. Firstly, the fact that an open license is intrinsic to true open access or open science. And that open license is one that not only ensures accessibility, but the full also allows full potential for reuse of the knowledge being published. So that is generally a Creative Commons or CC license, as it's often referred to. And that license ensures not only that authors retain copyright of their work, but that the research is not only available to read, but also to download, to share, and to reuse. And authors should not have to pay extra for this type of license. It should be part of publishing open access in a journal. A common challenge around open access, of course, remains article publication charges, or APCs, which are currently the predominant business model for open access publishing. And while, of course, there are costs for publishing that do need to be covered, authors can be discouraged and excluded from OA publishing by unreasonably high charges. And this is an ongoing discussion topic in the publishing industry and elsewhere, of course, but we're thinking about how to continue this transition to open access without excluding any of those researcher voices that we want to be part of that scientific conversation. So that, one way of doing that, and we are starting to see the emergence of new business models to trial different ways around APCs and new ways of funding open access publication. And they tend to focus more on institutions rather than the individuals and authors themselves. But of course, authors from Research for Life countries should be eligible for waivers to publish in journals. I would hope the majority of journals and from the majority of publishers. And these waivers, either partial or full, should be available from most publishers, as I was saying. But they can be difficult to discover and for authors to understand what policies exist and how they're applied. And therefore, Research for Life have produced some best practice guidelines here to really help publishers actually set out the information clearly for researchers to find and to ensure that it is as accessible as possible. I'm going to finish on predatory journals and predatory publishers. Predatory journals are ones that solicit articles from researchers through practices that exploit the pressure on researchers to publish. And features of predatory journals could include rapid pay-to-publish models without rigorous peer review, fake editorial boards falsely listing respected scientists, fraudulent impact factors, journal titles that are deceptively similar to those of legitimate journals, paid review articles that promote fake science, or journals that aggressively spam authors and potential reviewers with invitations to submit or review articles, often those outside a researcher's expertise. And all of these examples were in a report, a very useful report on combating predatory journals that has been released by the Inter-Academy Partnership to look at this issue. But furthermore, it's common practice for these predatory journals to exploit the author pays model of open access for financial gain. And therefore, it's often conflated with open access journals, leading to misconception that all open access journals are low quality. And that, of course, makes it really difficult for researchers to navigate the open access landscape, especially when there is pressure on them to publish, if this is linked to career advancement or research assessment. So how do authors and how can researchers go about recognizing a reputable and credible venue for their research? And here's where cross-industry initiatives such as Think, Check and Submit can help. And they provide a checklist for authors to consider where they should submit their research. And they ask authors and researchers a number of questions, such as how well known is the journal in your community? How clear are the journal's peer review guidelines? Are articles indexed or archived in dedicated services? Is it clear what fees are going to be charged and when they're going to be charged? Are author guidelines available and provided on the publisher's website? And is the publisher a member of recognized industry initiatives? But of course, researchers can and should talk to their librarian, who are experts in this area and can help them with identifying credible publication venues. And I'll finish by saying that, of course, true open science should combat these practices by making all the processes of scientific knowledge creation, evaluation, and communication completely transparent. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to Andy to look a bit more at one of those core practices of open science and publishing, and that's open data.
Thanks very much, Roheena. If we could move to the next slide, please. So I'm just going to start by talking about what open data really means. And we're talking about data that's available for everybody to access, to use and share without license, copyright, or patent. But before we assume that all data should be open, it's clear that some data can't. So, for example, open data could not include personal data, which might include patient data in medical journals, for example. Sorry, back one, please. Thank you. It might include commercially sensitive data. For example, if your data might be part of a patent application, or it might include other sensitive data that might benefit from being restricted. And I can give you a good example of that from a CABI case study. CABI has a network of plant-wise plant health clinics around 30 countries, and we aggregated data from the prescriptions, if you like, of the plant doctors that they were giving to their farmers. And when we analyzed that data and aggregated it, we were able to find that a worrying number of plant doctors were recommending that farmers spray antibiotics on their crops. Now, the data that we harvest from those plant clinics in those 30 countries is actually owned by the member countries themselves, and we're restricted from being able to disclose the individual contents of those prescriptions. So you can see that we would be restricted in terms of sharing the underlying data at the micro level, but we were not restricted from being able to aggregate them. And that paper has really opened up a really interesting avenue in research to look at this, the use of antibiotics in crop protection and its possible implications for antimicrobial resistance. So a really important example. A sort of nuance around open data is this concept of fair data. And that fair means findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Findable basically means that anyone can find it using common search tools, but it's not just anyone, it's also including machines. So as we get to the era of big data, the ability for machines to go out and find data from all over the web and then to aggregate it is going to be really important. It should be accessible. And that doesn't mean just that the data should be accessible, but also the metadata and the information that wraps around the data should be accessible so that people can find it in the first place. The data should be interoperable, which means that comparable data can be pooled and analyzed, for example, with common formats. So the concept of a meta-analysis is clearly much easier if you're able to pool similarly structured data. And it should be reusable, and that covers the fact that other people might want to use your data subsequently, so being able to wrap around the data information about what the licensing implications and the copyright might be. So while much data can benefit from being open, pretty much all data can benefit from being fair. And academic institutions and publishers have really picked up the banner of promoting both open data and fair data in the last decade or so. So let's move to the next slide. We could ask, well, why? What are the benefits of open and fair data? And really, they do pick up on lots of the themes that we've heard already around promoting research integrity. There's evidence now that sharing data increases the credibility of research. The concept of reproducibility in response really to really nasty examples of data fabrication and falsification. It's obviously much more difficult to hide that kind of research malpractice if the data is freely available and interrogable. The comparability question we've already covered in terms of being able to aggregate data to do further analysis is clearly beneficial. From the authors, important, and probably this is the biggest carrot, is that it will actually probably increase the citation of your research. So there is now plenty of evidence that including data alongside your publications will ultimately increase the citation rates and the data reuse. Allied to that, many journals, most journals really now have open data policies, and it's going to become increasingly required of authors that they comply with ever more stringent policies around sharing data. So if you don't embrace these concepts, the chances are the pool of journals that you can publish in will start to get worryingly small. And then finally, funders are increasingly mandating that data should be publicly available. There are 52 funders that now require data archiving. CABI, for example, now works with a number of funders to help to put in place data policies and practices that they communicate to their researchers during the funding process. And I think we'll see that trend continue and increase. So if it's such a great idea, what's stopping researchers, what's stopping you from sharing your data? The State of Open Data survey published in 2021, there's a link at the bottom, identified these major reasons. One was the concerns about the misuse of data, which is reasonable, but actually I would argue that if you have shared your data and you've clearly named it and put your stamp next to it, then the opportunities for misuse are actually significantly reduced. Not receiving appropriate credit or acknowledgement. I think that is a cultural example. Anna mentioned that earlier. If people are going to spend their time and effort going through the hassle of uploading and sharing their data, then it would be nice to get some credit. You do get credit in terms of citations, but it would be nice to be able to see other incentives being brought along. Lack of clarity around copyright and data licensing. That's an example of a webinar probably in its own right, and we could pick that up at a subsequent webinar around open access, I think. Requiring sensitivity around whether information requires consent. Certainly, as I mentioned, there are examples where sharing data is not advisable, but I think there are some good resources around to be able to go into that issue. And then the next one is around costs. There can be costs associated with sharing data. There are data repositories where there are fees associated with uploading, but I'm going to come on to that in a subsequent slide. And then finally, the fact that another lab might scoop me to a discovery. Actually, that number's gone down quite significantly since this survey has been run over multiple years. And I think that reflects the recognition that people realize that if they share their data in an open way and they put enough information around it, then they're actually protecting themselves from people stealing their data. Next slide, please. So why don't we talk a bit about some of the practical uses of open data? And in this case, I'm going to talk about agriculture because CABI is heavily invested in agriculture. And it's clear that data sets can be really valuable in helping to put together decision support tools and services that would help to increase the yields and subsequently reduce the losses through pests and diseases. So an example of that would be Earth observational data. So we have a project at CABI called PRISE, the Pest Risk Information Service, where we are taking Earth observational data and other meteorological data, and we're using that to help develop pest risk indicators so that we can take that weather data and say, okay, it hasn't rained for 3 weeks, you're at risk from this particular pest, go outside and check whether you have that pest in your crop. Soil data sets can be really important in terms of improving soil health, minimizing erosion, optimizing the rates of fertilizer application, soil acidity remediation, and the ISRIC soil data database has got lots of really, really valuable information about what's becoming an increasingly important area of focus. Other areas around the statistics around agricultural productivity, the way that funding, for example, flows to agricultural projects, the way that subsidies are spread around, nutritional data, lots of examples. And then finally, just to give you an example of how data has been used in practice, CABI has published a data set around the distribution of invasives and alien species in sub-Saharan Africa. And that data has now been downloaded 15,000 times and has been cited in 132 publications. since it was uploaded in 2018. So next slide. My final slide is then about, well, okay, if you want to do it, how would you go about sharing your data? And you can do that by several routes. You can upload to a general repository. So these would be repositories from companies like Dryad, Figshare, Harvard Dataverse, the Open Science Framework, Science Databank, Zenodo. Some of these are free. So for example, Zenodo, the Open Science Framework, they're definitely free. Some of them have fees associated, and we need to be clear about that up front. In some cases, your institutions may have institutional licenses that allow you, the individual, to deposit into those repositories for free, but that's something you would need to check locally. There are also subject-specific repositories. So here are just a few, like GenBank, the Protein Data Bank, the Pangea, and then there's another one in higher energy physics. I guess one of the advantages of these is that they mean that you're putting your data where your colleagues in your subject area are going to be looking. So there is a kind of discoverability benefit to where you place your data. If you can't find a general repository or a subject-specific repository that fits your needs, then there's a fair chance that your institution is now hosting or developing its own repository. So I would recommend that you ask your own librarian. And if you want to find out which repositories fit your needs or your specific subject areas, then there are really good sources like the Registry of Research Data Repositories, where you can put in keywords and find which repositories best fit your needs. I mentioned the fact that some repositories may charge. In some cases, the publishers actually require you to deposit your data during the process of submitting your manuscript. And in some cases, the publishers will actually cover the costs, like the Royal Society. And in many cases, the funders will actually allow researchers to build those costs into their research grants. So whether you have that right now, that's one thing, but whether you put that into your future research grant applications is something for you to consider so that you can cover that cost down the line. I mentioned the fact that now it's increasingly possible to upload and share data as part of the manuscript submission process. It's really important that if you want to get credit for doing that, it would be a really good idea to include a citation in your reference list, and also to make mention of it in the data accessibility statement that many journals now require. And then another option, which is increasingly viable in certain subject areas, is to publish your data as a data article. And these are really mini articles that are really saying, here's my data set, here's what it describes, and details of what's contained in it. Those data sets are then independently peer reviewed and can be published as separate articles. So you can actually gain a citation and an individual article output from a specific set of data. Now, even if you can't share your data for various reasons, you certainly can ensure that you include a data statement to ensure transparency. So I mentioned that earlier example around the CABI plant-wise data where we weren't able to give the detail at the country level. The data is still held by CABI, and there are contact details associated with that paper that mean that if you needed to access that or speak to the author to try and drill into some of that information, then you know where you can go. So being able to track down the owner and to be able to contact and talk to them is also part of making sure that you can access the data. Okay, and I think that's now it in terms of covering the data bit. So I'm going to hand back to Andrea.
Thank you, Andy. That was terrific. So if the speakers wouldn't mind turning their cameras back on, and we have a few moments to address some of the questions. I have had a quick look through the questions that we received from delegates in advance of today's webinar, and I think we've done a fairly good job actually of covering many of them already. Now, I'm going to also ask our support staff, our support team of Lenny and Kathy to let us know if any other questions had emerged in the meantime. But while they're doing that, I might just ask Anna to comment on the participation in the working groups that you mentioned, and whether what would be a feasible mechanism for that to happen.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. So I've posted in the chat the link to the working groups. It's actually fairly straightforward. You just register for a working group for the first meeting, and then you can participate. There is one working group that already had a first meeting, but you can just send an email to our contact, and I will post that as well. And then we can include you in the work of the working group. There are some channels for communication with the members of the working group, etc. So it's very open-ended, very easy to register and to be part of it. And you can always just send a message to me or to openscienceunesco.org, and we can include you in the working groups.
Thank you. So maybe one other question is about incentivization, and this was touched on during the presentations about why, on the one hand, it's hard to argue against the benefits of open science and openness and transparency in general. And yet we see some data from that state of open data that there is still some reluctance. And I wonder if any of the panelists would have a comment on what they might have seen from their perspective, and what do we need to do to incentivize authors and researchers to participate in the open science process a bit more willingly.
I can do just a very quick maybe part of the answer, because it's definitely a complex one, and I think that's the thing. There is not just one thing that needs to be done. I think there are actions that should be done across the spectrum, right? So there are incentives that can be done at the institutional level, kind of top down, whether it's through actual policies that institutions, or even at the national level, one can have an open access or an open science policy, which is more and more something that is happening. And the other one, as we were saying, I mean, one that really very, very often comes back to us is the fact that unless the way in which researchers are evaluated and their scientific careers are assessed, if that framework doesn't change, it is very, very difficult for researchers to really promote open science, because it's not necessarily always in their interest. So really this alignment of the different incentives has to happen as well. So that, kind of on a global level, this is what we get as feedbacks from our communities.
So maybe some of our audience that might be working in their libraries, within their Research for Life registered institutions, maybe they have a role to play to advocate for open science policies within their organizations. I can see lots of thumbs up flowing up my screen, which is lovely to see. So we have a couple of minutes left. Kathy, Lenny, have you spotted any questions emerging that we could usefully answer, do you think?
There seem to be very specific. There are a number of questions about predatory journal, how to spot them, and is there any standard on how the definition of predatory journal? Apparently, this is something very common. Our user run across a lot, so that's why the concern. Yeah. And also, they're saying that is the journal index in Scopus and Web of Science, can that be still predatory? So it's like they're very afraid, but what's the general guideline?
I'll make a quick comment, because Roheena, I thought, gave some really helpful pointers to how to recognize a predatory journal. I'll make one comment, then I'll ask Andy maybe to comment on what secondary publishers do to kind of filter out, if you like, predatory journals from databases like CABI Abstracts or Scopus or others. But it's worth commenting, worth reminding everybody on this webinar that Research for Life includes about something like 14,000 open access journals in its collection, and they are all added to the Research for Life database directly from the Directory of Open Access Journals, and they carry out a validation process to ensure that those journals aren't to the best of their knowledge, are not predatory journals. So I always say, if you're concerned, if you think a journal might be a predatory journal, check if it's available in Research for Life. Because if it's not in the Research for Life index, there's a good chance that it's a predatory title. So Andy, have you any comments on how you ensure that the predatory journals don't get into CAB abstracts?
Yeah, I can just say that we have a team of content editors who regularly screen the journals that we index, and every year we review those. We had a major clear out a couple of years ago where I think we removed around 100 journals because we felt that they were predatory. And so I think we're not alone in doing that. Most of the indexing organizations take this very seriously, and we have people who are trained to look at the various indicators of what might be predatory and to then take remedial action.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And we do have a number of those databases, including CAB abstracts, available through Research for Life. So that's another fantastic resource that you have available in order to check that, that the journals you're reading and also thinking of submitting to or advising your colleagues to submit to have passed those standards. So we're at the top of the hour. I'm going to wrap up. First of all, I'm going to thank our three main speakers today tremendously because I think they've really given a fantastic overview of some of the key aspects of open science, and hopefully have made it very clear that open science is not one thing, it's a combination and a whole sort of ecosystem of things, if you like. We've looked at how open science particularly has a relevance within the publishing system, and then we kind of dug into one of the aspects of open science through open data. But I remind you all that there will be a post-webinar survey. If you would like a similar webinar on one of the topics that we've covered, or maybe one of the things that we've just touched on, and you'd like to know a bit more about it, then please fill in the forms and we'll see what we can do. So just to conclude, don't forget that on the Research for Life website, under the training tab, there's a section that's labeled free resources from partners. And many of the Research for Life partners make available a wide range of capacity building resources, and many of them address the sorts of topics that we're covering through this webinar series. So please do remember to consult that area of the website. Don't forget to fill out the survey, and we will make all the presentations and recordings available in a few days on the Research for Life website. The next webinar is on Wednesday, the 8th of June, and it will cover the topic of writing winning grant proposals and how to get your research successfully funded. So I'm sure that will be tremendously interesting. And if you haven't already signed up for it, please do. So with that, I will end my slideshow. Thank everybody very much and wish you all a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.